In the last years of the 16th century, circumstances came together to provide the context for a miracle in the Low Countries. Spain's attempt to suppress the region caused large-scale immigration, as the population migrated north from the southern provinces, causing cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp to suffer what one scholar has called a catastrophic hemorrhage of inhabitants. The timing was fortuitous. The trade ban ensured that there were huge stockpiles of grain and herring, which meant that food supplies were both plentiful and cheap. Although rents rose quickly, the swelling of the population also produced a boom in house construction and brought together an effective group of experienced merchants and other professionals who were trying to escape the pressure exerted by the Spanish. When the blockade was finally lifted in 1590, the Dutch moved quickly to clear out Spanish troops who had been sent to maintain order, taking advantage of the fact that Philip II of Spain had become embroiled in military conflict elsewhere in Europe. Suddenly free from military pressure and with a window of opportunity presenting itself, the Dutch threw themselves into international trade, seeking to build connections with the Americas, Africa, and Asia. There was a clear commercial logic to the plan of establishing their own trade routes. Bringing goods directly to the Dutch Republic would avoid two routes of taxation. First, goods would drive without having had duties creamed off in ports in Portugal and Spain, where cargoes were typically taxed before being sent north. Second, the fact that the Dutch authorities would now collect the revenues themselves, rather than pass them back to the Iberian masters, meant that the money produced from the thriving commerce in the Low Countries would not leach out to fund imperial ambitions and reckless spending elsewhere. This would bring immediate benefits and create a virtuous circle, as greater profits would be reinvested, generating even stronger cash flows, both for individual merchants and for the fledgling republic. The ambitious program paid dividends from the outset. An expedition that set out for the east in 1597 returned home the following year in triumph, carrying cargoes that produced profits of 400%. Fleets now began to fan out in all directions, funded by investors emboldened by such strong returns on their capital. In 1601 alone, 14 separate expeditions set sail for Asia, while as many as 100 vessels a year were soon crossing the Atlantic to acquire salt from the Araya Peninsula, which was vital for the domestic herring trade. The Spanish were outraged. They renewed their military action and imposed another blockade. According to the brilliant philosopher and lawyer Hugo Grotius, this simply reinforced the point that the Dutch had to take their destiny into their own hands. Rather than step back in the face of threats and pressure, the only choice was to invest yet more in commercial ventures and build a trade network as quickly as possible to help build up firepower and reinforce independence. It was a question of all or nothing. Key to Dutch success was superb shipbuilding, and above all, innovations in the classic designs that had long enabled herring fleets to operate successfully in the North Sea and in shallow harbors thanks to their low draughts. From the 1550s, as the English built quicker and stronger warships, the Dutch focused their efforts on developing vessels that handled even better, could carry more cargo, required fewer crew to operate, and were therefore cheaper to run. These ships, called vloeds, set a new benchmark for commercial shipping. The Dutch did their homework and were well prepared when they set sail. While their European predecessors, who had crossed the Atlantic and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, were journeying into the unknown, the Dutch were not. They knew what they were looking for and where to find it. Authors like Jan Huygens van Linschoten, secretary to the Archbishop of Goa, who spent his time thoroughly researching trade routes, harbors, markets, and local conditions across Asia, produced texts such as the Itinerario, which provided comprehensive blueprints that served almost as instruction manuals for those setting out for the East. Other works were also useful in preparing traders for their travels. The Dutch were world leaders when it came to cartography. Maps and sea charts, prepared by the engraver Lucas Janszoon, Wagner in the 1580s were considered indispensable throughout Europe thanks to their detail and accuracy. Attention was paid to collecting precise information and producing updated, detailed atlases of the East Indies as well as that of the Caribbean. Caribbean. These set the standard for modern navigational aids in the early 17th century. Then there were texts that help explain the vocabulary and grammar of the strange languages that Dutch traders could expect to encounter on their travels. One of the earliest of these new linguists was Frederick de Houtman, whose Dutch-Malay dictionary and grammar was published in 1603 following his release from prison by the Sultan of Sumatra, where he had diligently learnt the language of his captors. Such vocabulary lists were avidly studied by merchants heading to Asia in the 16th century. They set out useful words and phrases translated from Dutch into Malayalam, Malay, Bizayan, Tagalog, Tamil, and other languages. The underlying secret to Dutch success in the 17th century was common sense and hard work. The Dutch reckoned that the way to work was not to follow the example of England, where the chartered companies used sharp practices to limit beneficiaries to a small circle of intimates, all looking after each other and their interests and using monopoly practices to protect their positions. Instead, capital was pooled and risks shared among as wide as a body of investors as possible. In due course, the conclusion was reached that despite competing ambitions and rivalries between provinces, cities, and indeed individual merchants, the most efficient and powerful way to build up trade was by combining resources. In 1602, therefore, the government of the United Provinces created a single entity to conduct trade with Asia on the principle that this would be stronger and more powerful than the sum of its parts. It was a bold move, not least since it involved smoothing local rivalries and convincing all involved that interests would not only be aligned but be better served in this way. The creation of the VOC, the East Indies Company, and not long afterwards the sister corporation for the Americas, the West Indies Company, RWIC, the West Indies Company, was a textbook example of how to set up a world-class multinational corporation. So we have the East Indies Company, the EIC, and the West Indies Company, WIC, the West Indies Company. The Dutch model proved astonishingly successful, although some, like the merchant and founder of the West Indies Company, argued that the best idea was to colonize parts of the Americas that were yet to be settled. A clear plan took shape. The aim was not to try to compete with other European merchants, such as in Goa, where Portuguese, Venetian, and German traders lived side by side. It was to displace them. The aggressive approach paid off immediately. Attention turned first to the Spice Islands, where the isolated Portuguese community was expelled in 1605 as part of a systematic program to establish control over the East Indies. Over the following decades, the Dutch kept consolidating their position in establishing a permanent headquarters in Batavia, the name a nod to the appellation given to the inhabitants of the Low Countries during the time of the Roman Empire, in what is now Jakarta. Military forces was used to take and secure a chain of points linking back to the motherland. Although the Dutch were frustrated in a few locations, such as Macau and Goa, the gains that were made in the 17th century were impressive indeed. Soon it was not just the Europeans abroad who were beleaguered by the Dutch, but local rulers as well, whose realms were strategically sensitive or economically important. Control was established over Malacca, Colombo, Cochin, before the Sultanate of Makassar in modern Indonesia was targeted in 1669. Makassar was the missing piece necessary in establishing a monopoly over the spice trade with Asia. Renamed New Rotterdam, its capture was followed by the construction of a major fort, as had been the case elsewhere, a statement of intent that such gains were not going to be surrendered lightly. A map held in the state archives in The Hague depicts the veritable spider's web that was spun as the Dutch built up their position in the East Indies. The same pattern was followed elsewhere. Rivals were pushed out of West Africa as the Dutch succeeded in dominating the gold trade and in due course became heavily involved in the slave trafficking to the Americas. New strongholds were founded, such as Fort Nassau in modern Ghana. The Portuguese were pushed out of other bases, which passed into Dutch hands in the middle of the 17th century. There was considerable success in the Caribbean and the Americas as well, to the point that by the 1640s the Dutch had gained a major share of transatlantic shipping and controlled the sugar trade outright. The Low Countries were transformed. Fortunes were made for those who had invested in long-distance trade early on, while those who were beneficiaries of the new rich did well as well. Universities were founded at Leiden and Groningen, where scholars could push the boundaries of academic disciplines thanks to the funding of generous patrons. Artists and architects flourished, reveling in the sudden interest and wealth of a freshly minted bourgeoisie. In times of extraordinary affluence, magnificent buildings started to go up in Amsterdam, which rose from the water as Venice had done centuries earlier. Areas like the Jordan were reclaimed from the sea as canal houses went up on the Keizersgracht and nearby that were feats of engineering as well as architectural wonders. The influence of the Silk Roads began to be felt in the arts. A thriving ceramics industry blossomed in Haarlem, Amsterdam, and above all in Delft, heavily influenced by the look, feel, and design of items imported from the East. Chinese visual themes dominated, while the characteristic blue and white wares developed centuries earlier by potters in the Persian Gulf, which had become popular in China and in the Ottoman Empire, were adopted so widely that they became the distinctive feature of Dutch ceramics. Imitation was not only the sincerest form of flattery. In this case, it was also part of joining a global system of material culture that now linked the North Sea with the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. With demand increasing for objects that helped show status, the arts in general in the Netherlands flourished. Some have suggested that 3 million paintings were produced in the 17th century alone. It was inevitable that this would stimulate new ideas and also raise standards, providing a context for painters like Rembrandt to create works of breathtaking beauty. Given the remarkable way that the Dutch had worked together to enjoy success, it was entirely appropriate that some of the most beautiful works recorded, groups such as the Banquet of the Guard of St. Adrian, the Civic Guard of Haarlem by Frans Hals, or Rembrandt's famous work, The Company of Captain Frans Banning, and Lieutenant Wilhelm van Ruytenbroek preparing to march out, more usually referred to as the Night Watch, which was commissioned for the banqueting hall of the Civic Guard of Amsterdam. Individuals were eager patrons too, with the merchant Andries Bicker, for example, hiring Bartholomeus van der Heist to commemorate his success and newly elevated social status, or the shipbuilder Jan Richten asking Rembrandt to paint a portrait of him and his wife working together on nautical designs. It was the turn of the Dutch and of Dutch art to experience a golden age. The Dutch were keen to show off their homeware, as in the case of Vermeer's Young Woman Reading a Letter at an Open Window, where a blue and white bowl features prominently in the foreground. An English visitor to Amsterdam in 1640 could not hide how impressed he was by what he saw. In the Low Countries, wrote Peter Mundy, even houses of indifferent quality were filled with furniture and ornaments, very costly and curious, full of pleasure and home contentment. Cupboards, cabinets, imagery, porcelain, costly fine cages with birds, and more besides. Even butchers and bakers, blacksmiths and cobblers had paintings and luxury trinkets in their homes. I was amazed, wrote the English diarist John Evelyn, about the annual fair in Rotterdam at about the same time. It was flooded with paintings, especially with landscapes, as they call those representations. Even common farmers had become avid art collectors. These attitudes were typical of the growing numbers of English visitors to the Low Countries in this period. The Dutch Golden Age was the result of a finely executed plan. It had also the benefit of being well timed, coming at a time when much of Europe was in disarray, engaging in endless rounds of costly and inconclusive military hostility, which engulfed the continent during the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648. This volatility presented opportunities for the attention and resources that were diverted into arenas closer to home, which allowed the Dutch to pick off their targets on different continents one by one without facing retribution. The bloody fighting in the 17th century enabled the Dutch to establish a dominant position in the East at the expense of their rivals in Europe. European warfare, however, had an even more important role. It prompted the rise of the West. Discussions about Europe in this period emphasized that the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason saw a coming of age where ideas of absolutism were replaced by notions of freedom, rights, and liberty. But it was Europe's entrenched relationship with violence and militarism that allowed it to place itself as the center of the world after the great expeditions of the 1490s. Even before the near simultaneous discoveries of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, competition between kingdoms in Europe had been intense. For centuries, the continent had been characterized by fierce rivalry between states that frequently erupted into open hostility and war. This in turn prompted advancements in military technology. New weapons were developed, introduced, and then refined after being tested on the battlefield. Tactics evolved as commanders learned from their experience. The concept of violence was institutionalized. European art and literature had long celebrated the life of the chivalrous knight and his capacity to use force judiciously, as an act of love and faith, but also as an expression of justice. Stories about the Crusades, which praised nobility and heroism and hid treachery, betrayal, and the breaking of sworn oaths, became intoxicatingly powerful. Fighting, violence, and bloodshed were glorified, as long as they could be considered just. This was one reason, perhaps, why religion came to be so pertinent. There could be no better justification of war than its being in defense of the Almighty. From the outset, the fusion of religion and expansion were closely bound together. Even the sails of Columbus's ships were marked by large crosses. As contemporary commentators constantly stressed, in regard to the Americas, but also as Europeans began to fan out over Africa, India, and other parts of Asia, and then Australia as well, it was all part of God's plan for the West to inherit the earth. In fact, Europe's distinctive character as more aggressive, more unstable, and less peace-minded than other parts of the world now paid off. After all, this was why the great vessels of the Spanish and the Portuguese had proved successful in crossing the oceans and connecting continents together. The traditional built craft that had sailed across the Indian and Arabian seas for centuries with little change to their design were no match for Western vessels that could outmaneuver and outgun them at will. Continuous improvements in ship design that made them faster, stronger, and more deadly widened the gulf ever further. The same was true of military technology. Such was the reliability and accuracy of arms used in the Americas that small numbers of conquistadors were able to dominate populations that were vastly superior numerically, and populations that were advanced and highly sophisticated, except when it came to weapons. In the Inca lands, wrote Pedro de Sousa de Leon, law and order were carefully maintained, with great care taken to see that justice was meted out and that nobody ventured to commit a felony or theft. Data was collected annually across the Inca Empire to make sure taxes were calculated correctly and fairly paid, with births and deaths recorded centrally and kept up to date. The elite had to work the land themselves for a set number of days each year and did so to set an example for everybody, and how they were to know that there should be nobody so rich that he might disdain or affront the poor. These were not the savages described by triumphalists in Europe. In fact, they seemed positively enlightened in comparison to the highly stratified societies that emerged throughout most of the continent, where the gap between the powerful and the weak was cemented in an aristocratic patrimony that protected the social position of the powerful. Although Europeans might have thought they were discovering primitive civilizations, and that this was why they could dominate them, the truth was that it was the relentless advances in weapons, warfare, and tactics that laid the basis for the success of the West. One reason why the domination of Africa, Asia, and the Americas was possible was the centuries of European practice in building fortifications that were all but impregnable. Castle building had been the staple of European society since the Middle Ages, with thousands of spectacular strongholds springing up across the continent. Their purpose, of course, was to withstand heavy and determined attack. Their extraordinary number was testimony to the fear and regularity of assault. Europeans were world leaders in building fortresses and in storming them. It was striking how the European insistence on constructing imposing sites that could be secured from the inside was a source of bemusement to locals. No other traders had built forts in the past, noted Nawab of Bengal in the 1700s. So why on earth did the Europeans insist on doing so now? The great irony then was that although Europe experienced a glorious golden age, producing flourishing art and literature and leaps of scientific endeavor, it was forged by violence. Not only that, but the discovery of new worlds served to make European society more unstable. With more to fight over and ever greater resources available, stakes were raised, sharpening tensions as the battle for supremacy intensified. The centuries that followed the emergence of Europe as a global power were accompanied by relentless consolidation and covetousness. In 1500, there were around 500 political units in Europe. In 1900, there were 25. The strong devoured the weak. Competition and military conflict were endemic to Europe. In this sense, later horrors in the 20th century had their roots in the deep past. The struggle to dominate neighbors and rivals spurred improvements in weapons technology, mechanization, and logistics, which ultimately allowed arenas of warfare to be expanded substantially and enabled the numbers killed to rise from the hundreds to the millions. In time, however, persecution would be perpetrated on a massive scale. It was not for nothing that World War and the worst genocide in history had their origins and execution in Europe. These were the last chapters in a long-running story of brutality and violence. Thus, while focus normally falls on the investment in art and the impact of new wealth on culture in the 16th and 17th centuries, it is perhaps more instructive to look to the parallel advances in weapon making in this period. Just as paintings were produced in enormous quantities for a hungry audience, so too were guns. By the 1690s, some 600,000 flintlocks were being sold by the entrepreneur Maximilian Titon in central France alone. Some contemporaries thought it was impossible even to estimate how many workers were employed in the handgun industry because they were so numerous. Between 1600 and 1750, the rate of successful fire of handguns multiplied by a factor of 10. Technological advances, including the invention of ramrods, paper cartridges, and bayonets, made guns cheaper, better, quicker, and more deadly. Similarly, although the names of scientists like Galileo Galilei, Isaac Newton, have become famous to generations of school children, it can all too easily be forgotten that some of their most important work was on the trajectory of projectiles and understanding the causes of deviation to enable artillery to be more accurate. These distinguished scientists helped make weapons more powerful and ever more reliable. Military and technological advances went hand in hand with the age of enlightenment. It was not that aggression did not exist in other societies, as numerous examples across other continents would show. Anti-conquest could bring death and suffering on a large scale, but periods of explosive expansion across Asia and North Africa, such as in the extraordinary first decades of the spread of Islam or during the time of the Mongol conquests, were followed by long periods of stability, peace, and prosperity. The frequency and rhythm of warfare was different in Europe to other parts of the world. No sooner would one conflict be resolved than another would flare up. Competition was brutal and relentless. In that sense, seminal works like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan were quintessential texts that explained the rise of the West. Only a European author could have concluded that the natural state of man was to be in a constant state of violence, and only a European author would have been right. Moreover, the thirst for military confrontation lay behind other developments that were closely related to warfare, such as in those of finance. Governments in Europe were hungry for capital to fund armies, leading to the establishment of debt markets where money could be raised against future tax revenues. Betting on success would produce handsome profits and unlock titles and other social benefits for canny investors, whose investment in government debts could naturally be presented as patriotism. Investing in state finances was a way of getting ahead, as well as becoming rich. London and Amsterdam became global centers of finance, specializing in sovereign debt, but also in increasingly complex stock market listings. One reason for the rise to prominence of London and Amsterdam was the socio-economic acceleration of Northern Europe. The latest research suggests that the population almost doubled in England and the Low Countries between 1500 and 1800, a period of 300 years. Of course, most of this growth was felt in densely populated areas where the number of large towns rose by nearly 3 times. The process was particularly acute in the Low Countries. In the middle of the 17th century, as many as half the residents of Amsterdam are thought to have moved to the city from elsewhere. States with more urban centers had a considerable advantage over those with large rural populations. It was less time-consuming, easier, and more efficient to gather taxes from cities, not least since the velocity of commercial exchange was so much greater than in the countryside. Densely populated areas also produced more reliable income streams and were less likely to lend to. England and the Dutch Republic could borrow more at better rates than their commercial and political competitors. Then as now, to make money in finance, it was not enough to be smart, you had to be in the right place. And increasingly, that meant London or Amsterdam. This marked the start of the death knell for Italy and the Adriatic. Already on the back foot thanks to new routes to market, which brought goods directly to the richest consumers, the city-states with their deeply entrenched rivalries stood no chance against clusters of towns able and willing to combine their resources. Such large sums were raised to fund expansion that it became standard to spend more than half of state revenues simply servicing national debts. It was expensive to be locked in a constant fight against neighbors and constantly striving to gain a political, commercial, and cultural edge. The land of the Europeans became a continent running at 2 speeds. Old Europe in the east and the south, which had dominated for centuries and which now sagged and stagnated, and New Europe in the northwest, which boomed. Some say the writing on the wall before others. As early as 1600, the British ambassador to Venice was able to write that in the matter of trade, the decay is so manifest that all men conclude within 20 years' space the city would all but collapse. Venice had once dominated trade with the East, but it was now no longer able to compete. Scores of mighty ships of above 1,000 tons apiece, used to bring goods back home or head out to reload now, not one is to be seen. It was not long before the city began to reinvent itself, transforming from a commercial powerhouse to a center of lascivious living, a hedonist delight. Although the authorities tried to put an end to the wearing of bigger and better jewels, to increasingly ostentatious parties and pleasure-seeking thrills, the city's reinvention was in many ways understandable. What other choices did it have? In the place of international commerce and high politics, Venice, Florence, and Rome became stops on a tourist trail for the new rich, although first referred to as the Grand Tour in 1670. Such expeditions began a century earlier, when a trip to Italy was first recognized as presenting an opportunity to buy high-quality antiquities, as well as more voguish art, whose prices leapt as the numerous numbers of visitors rose. It was a rite of passage, not just for the individuals who took part, but for culture as a whole. The fruits of southern Europe were being devoured by the north. As the continent's center of gravity shifted, so did the jewels of ancient and contemporary culture. 3 of the finest collections of ancient sculptures in the world, held at the British Museum, as you know, is in London, the Fitzwilliam Museum, which is in Cambridge, and the Ashmolean Museum, which is in Oxford, were gathered by culturally curious travelers who were blessed with deep pockets. Of course, now these were the antecedents of archaeologists, and they were commonly referred to as antiquarians. They brought back ideas about architecture, monumental tomb design, and sculpture. It was not long before the poetry, art, music, garden design, medicine, and science of classical antiquity were being extensively borrowed from as England and the Low Countries set about modeling the glory of the present on that of the ancient past. Roman citizens would have stood agape in the idea that small landowners and petty officials from what had once been a leafy, if out-of-the-way province of the empire were commissioning busts portraying themselves not just as their heirs to the Romans, but as emperors. Soon they would be doing more. Britannia was about to rule.